This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. So often we find ourselves talking about innovation in the humanitarian aid and development space in terms of gadgets or technologies, the shiny objects of the future, is like I like to call them. While there is certainly a lot to be said about how the brave new digital world will allow us to help those in need more effectively, sometimes it just isn't necessary to take a massive leap when helping others. My guest today on the 122nd episode of the Terms of Reference podcast, Wanjala Wafula, is a classic problem solver and think-on-your-feet innovator. His organization, called the Coexist initiative, has been working on gender issues in Kenya and beyond for more than a decade. And while they absolutely use the latest in technology, social media, and more, they also often rely on the most simple tools and ideas to help create change. I spoke with Wanjala in Kitengela. And hey, before we dive into the episode, if you like what you're hearing, take a moment to open up iTunes or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click subscribe. Also, consider giving the show a rating. It really does help. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast in general on Facebook or Twitter and help others get in on making aid and development better. Now on to the show with Wanjala. Hello, Wanjala. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's such a pleasure to have me here today.
Let's see, we're recording this in late August of 2016. Where are you sitting today?
I'm sitting in my tiny little office in a little dusty town called Kitengela on the outskirts of Nairobi here in Africa. Yeah, it's a little dusty town. Kitengela is 40 kilometers from Nairobi City.
Wow. And is it, I guess, at the end of August, is it starting to cool off, heat up? Is it rainy? Is it dry? What is it?
You know, when people talk about climate change, I used to think that it's about something else, not Africa. But here, it's supposed to be raining, but we are having now sandstorms. It's as dusty as it gets. It's as hot as everything else. So we're sitting in a very hot, dusty place.
Oh, wow. And you're saying that, not to take us down a crazy path right now, but you're saying that that's been a change you've seen over your lifetime?
This is the worst I've ever seen. I live on a little farm here, and all my trees are drying. The trees that have been up for 5-6 years are now just drying. It's too hot. Oh, just terribly dry.
That's terrible to hear. This show isn't necessarily about climate change, but maybe it'll play a factor in what you do. You direct an organization called the Coexist initiative. Why don't we just start by you telling us about what your focus is and how you implement your programming across Kenya and beyond?
Coexist initiative actually is originally started as a national NGO working around men, boys, and communities towards fostering social justice and human rights for especially women and girls. It was founded about 10 years ago, and the objective then was to be able to change the paradigm shift in terms of thinking around gender. You remember then we had just had a Beijing platform, and where the movements were up and women were coming up to say women's problems were indeed women's problems. And so men were only seen as perpetrators and not as partners. And for many years, that statement was made very popular. Women, it was men against women or women against men. So, and personal encounter in my life when I lost my sister, it made me think about what role men can play in enhancing social justice and inclusion. And therefore, I decided to abandon a bit of my journalism background, which is my profession and my hobby, to go into this setting up the Coexist initiative to say men, communities, and another have to play a role in ensuring that justice for all.
Give us an example. Maybe you can tell us a story about how you are tackling the gender problem or women's issues. Let's call it equality. I don't even know what umbrella to wrap it under properly. But by focusing on men, how are you doing things differently? What's your unique twist?
Because my whole thinking is that men who are 95, all the research around the world shows that most of the violence against women is 95 perpetrated by men and boys. It also shows that even if women are starting to be aggressive towards men around the world, they are less violent towards men than men violent towards women. The programming then was that men were not included in the programming, were not part of the solution. Men were always part of the problem. And so how do we change it? We change it by talking about issues around masculinities. We talk about the raising up of boys. We talk about the dangers of violence, not even just to women alone, but to men and boys. We teach them about the need, the role that women can play in improving the qualities of families and societies and everything, and the economic aspects of families and nations. And so we teach men, first of all, on how not to be what societies expect of them. We develop materials that the men have to read. We do documentaries that educate men about the dangers of things associated with alcohol and substance abuse and wife battering. In many ways, Coexist believes that violence is learned. Nobody's born violent. Societies teach men how to be violent. Customs and traditions teach men how to be violent. The socialization process and the environments in which men grow teach them how to be violent. The media typifies men who are violent. So we design programs that go to men and boys to tell them about the negative dangers of socialization and how that contributes to violence. We teach them, for example, that risky sexual behavior. When African men say they're not going to use condoms when they even are going into carnal relationships, the danger is they're getting HIV. We teach them about things like the dangers of alcohol, like drink and driving. They are dying out of accidents. We teach them about violence. And in the process, it hurts them. So when we teach men about some of the negative socialization processes that societies and communities and environments put on them, and then we leverage that with them being part of a movement to change women, we've seen people change. We've seen communities that were originally marrying girls as young as 12 and 13, and there was a girl in secondary school, all of a sudden accepting 65,000 girls to go back to school. UNHCR just voted that as the best strategy ever. We've seen communities where we had female genital mutilation in many parts of Africa, and now we go and talk to men and communities and religious leaders, and the practice stops. We've seen a place where girls were not being allowed to go to school in countries like Malawi and Zambia and even Kenya and Somalia, and now we have rates of girls going up. So we think that our program is unique because we're tackling the root cause of women's disempowerment, which is actually equally working with men and boys.
So I know you and I have met before. We've done some work together before, and I know that you've got a fairly old school approach. On this show we have at least in recent history, we've been talking a lot about big data and technology and using mobile phones and blah blah blah. But you've got a fairly old school approach. Why don't you tell us about what that walk us through? How do you go into a community?
It's very interesting, Stephen, how people think that we are at old school strategy. We actually are very high tech. I mean, I have a master's degree in communication.
I stand corrected, man. Put me down.
No, Coexist actually uses very interesting, very cutting edge technologies. We just developed an app that is going to be working with communities. People in Africa have a lot of the cell phone technology is actually on the rise, and so we just together with the University of Nairobi, we just developed an app that is going to be used to report violence, not just from women's perspectives but also from men, because there was a study that was carried here that showed that 80% of women in East Africa do not report violence. Of violence. In a nutshell, Stephen, we develop apps with universities. We are on all the social media platforms. We use extensively using the Twitter and on Instagram and all these new technologies that have come in to mobilize communities, to mobilize the youth. When we're talking men, we're not just talking men who are 150 years. We're also talking boys who are at university, who are in their 20s, who are tech savvy, but yet who also perpetuate violence. We have a university in Kenya that was recording up to 1,000 rape cases every weekend. And we have had to improve our Facebook pages and improve our Twitter forms. And so we are using every technology to be able to mobilize specific target groups. But of course, we cannot use technology to go into an isolated Somali community. To go there and give them phones to be able to report. We have to physically go there.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about. Especially when you and I sat down, and some of the videos you have online, and some of the propaganda you put out there is your process of going into those communities. So take us there.
Yes, because one of the things is that when we are working with rural, isolated places, we do what is called a village scan, which is we take people who know the village, they go into the village, we identify gaps that we can be able to exploit to get them. For example, I'll give you an example. We went to northern Kenya, which borders Somalia. I don't know if I've told you this story before. And we start with the elders, and they said they didn't respect women and they didn't want girls to go to school. But we had gone with two pilots, two pilots, one from Kenya Airways and another one from the UN. And we told them about the value of a woman and showed them the two pilots and told them how the things they had done with their families. And then we told them how the pilots had bought their father's cars and they had sunk boreholes for them and had bought more camels than they expected. And we left. After 2 months, we went back. The UNHCR said 60,000 girls had been taken back to school. We originally have to find out what is the weakness, what's the thinking of a community. Because at Coexist, we believe in moving from the known to the unknown. Until you know what people know at the moment, you can't change them to telling them what they don't know. So that has been interesting. We've been to places where we went to mobilize kids in schools and we didn't have funding. And so we designed a very informal method called the rumor method, where we used lollipops, 20 lollipops.
Did you just say the rumor method, like telling a rumor?
Yes, okay. like starting a rumor. We started a rumor. We went there and used 20
See, now this is
lollipops.
what I'm talking about. Super low tech. Okay, take me 20 lollipops. Go for it.
Yeah. So we went there and we were supposed to get money from a funding agency that said they had put money through our banking systems. When I got there, we got there with my team. We had to go drive for a whole day. And when we got to one side of, that was in Mombasa on the coast, we checked their bank accounts. The money was not there. And I had a team of about 15 people willing to run a project. So we had to sit under a table and I had to explain to them we have to think outside the box. We have to think of how we're going to mobilize this community and tell them about the dangers of child marriage and of promote the girls' education. They didn't understand me. So at night, I decided to go and buy 20 lollipops. I went to 10 primary schools and sat with each of the head teachers and I said, please just recommend a girl and a boy to me. And so the teacher will bring in a girl and a boy, and I'll say, you are the best student in this school, and the headmaster has told me that you are the best. I want to let you know that tomorrow we'll be having a community meeting, but don't tell anyone. We've just told you it's only you to come, or tell anyone that you trust only one. Of course, I had discovered that when tell children not to tell something, they will tell everyone. And I had also discovered that when you tell a girl less than 14, the first person they will tell is their father. And if you tell a boy less than 14, the first person they will tell is their mother. So we used 20 lollipops. Those were 20 children in 10 schools. Believe me, Stephen, by 9 o'clock the following day, the venue had 5,000 people who didn't know how they were invited.
That is honestly the most ridiculous story I've ever heard. That is fantastic. That is awesome.
We keep thinking that we must use posters and banners and do all these fancy things when we can use basic innovation around things. Another story, we once went to a place called the Akaya Forest. The Kaya. It's a very rural population that lives on the Kenyan coast. It stretches all the way to Somalia. They're half Muslim, but they're also half very traditional. They're savages. And so we were told about this population of people who live in the forest. And they have a ceremony every other year where they take all this traditional alcohol, crude alcohol drinks, and they go on a sex orgy. They mean a man must sleep with as many women and children and girls. And so I went to that community. I went with that community, and of course they do not want to hear anything about condoms, or you can't talk about sex because they hide under Islam. They're also traditional, so you cannot have a public rally. So I went there and sat with the elders, and of course with a bit of translation, sat with the elders in the evening, and I asked them, how does anyone talk to them? They said, they only listen to their gods. Only their gods talk to them. And I asked, how do their gods talk to them? And they said the gods talk to them through song and dance. And that same evening, we identified one of the young musicians that they say the gods speak to. And he was a bit very high on alcohol when he was saying very nasty things about women. We lured him out of the forest, took him out of the forest for 2 days. Of course, nobody knew he had disappeared. We sat with him. We told him the things about the dangers of child marriage and this sex work with children, and of course made him very high. So the following day, we arrived earlier, he came later, and when the elders were very high, he stood up to make a declaration, and he said the ancestors were upset with men sleeping with young children and abusing women. They wanted us to let children go to school. And there was silence in the forest. Today, a ceremony that used to be called drumbeat, where about 10,000 women were being rounded up and abused in the whole forest. Today, the ceremony was banned. We have some of the best performing students on the coast come from the forest. That's 4 years later. And the ceremony ended because we became gods, isn't it? I think I became a god.
Another first. You're the first person on the show to actually be a god. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I became a god. I had to say, please don't marry women, and they understood. So they are not. Yeah. So Coexist has actually been.
So your stories, I knew coming as you're a great storyteller, right? This is what you do. This is how. But your stories make it sound really easy. But you've been doing this for 10 years. What are some of the deepest challenges that you've experienced? What are the setbacks? What are the difficulties that people have faced? Because, some people may listen to this show and say, oh, gosh, all we got to do is find the right guy in Kenya, or we got to find the right person in South Africa, and so they can snap their fingers and make it happen. So tell us about the challenges. Tell us about how hard it is.
One of the things, Steve, is that I'm still writing, but I was a very budding journalist. But I told you when we met last time that the death of my twin sister to sexual rape changed my thinking around violence towards women and girls. And so for me, it is not just a passion now, it's a calling, because I think every time I wake up, I feel that my sisters and my people in the communities will be proud that I'm doing what I'm doing. The challenge number one is that you wake up every morning wanting to make the world safe for not just women and girls, but also men, but you are trusted by neither of them. Women's organizations don't trust us men. They think we're only there to get the money that was supposed to go to women's projects. And the men do not trust us because the men think we are sissies and losers. So you see, you're working with two groups that still don't trust one another. Mm-hmm. We worked for 5 years and we didn't get any funding. I had to sell some of my cars and my things to be able to run programs. Until after 5 years is when we started getting some little funding. You see, that's why we had to decided to be just innovative and work outside the box. We didn't have money to buy big 4x4 cars to go into these places. We didn't have money to do posters or banners or anything else, So we were just working from innovation. So the first challenge is working with the gender suspicion between women organizations that think men are taking over the agenda and men who we are supposed to be targeting who do not think we are men enough. So that for me, that's number one. Number two is that the key challenge now, especially in this part of Africa, is that we have all the rules, the laws, the legislation is in place. But none of these governments are serious about implementing existing legislation. Because most of the leaders in Africa and many parts of the world are still boggled down by patriarchy and by patriarchy and all this, and therefore they still see and interpret policy from a man against woman thinking. That's why if you ask all these governments about the budget they allocate towards gender justice, human rights, and promotion of equity, almost zero. And that's why, for example, the Millennium Development Goals, in my view, became some goof in many areas of the world because of the lack of understanding between the socialization of men and because men in Africa are socialized to think they are superior, and women are socialized to imagine that they are inferior. So getting these two genders to come to one table where a man who is illiterate and didn't go to school thinks that a woman who holds a PhD is useless just because he was born a man. You see, so it has become a challenge. The third challenge is the infighting between civil societies. Last week I was invited to 3 conferences that were all talking about a specific law that exists in Kenya. There's a lot of replication, duplication, and invention of the wheel. Everybody's doing the same. If one is talking about AIDS, everyone goes to HIV/AIDS. And another one goes to human rights, everybody goes. There's no diversity, there's no innovation, there's no thinking outside the box. So for me, those are the main challenges.
So just some small issues that you're trying to... Okay, what was the fourth one?
I mean, of course, the fourth one is the continued exposure of, you have countries that only exist in cities. The gap between the poor and the rich in many African countries is enormous. I mean, you go to towns and you talk about legislation, which means people are a bit aware of the laws. But then when you go to the rural areas, they ask you which country you come from because they have not even heard of any country. So the fact that there's a very fragmented development in African countries where you have some regions of a country as very high-tech. There are places where half of this country, Kenya, where I'm sitting, is not connected via internet.
Sure.
I can't use my mobile phone. So if I have to use innovation or things that go with innovation and everything, how am I going to use when I have no access to the net, I have no access to the phone, I cannot do anything. So I have to think outside the box. Yeah.
So you've been doing this for 10 years. You've come up with some solutions. You're getting some traction, and clearly, I mean, you're a god. So what's the next 5 years look like? What do you have coming down the pipe, and do you have some new interesting ways that you're going to be tackling this problem?
Because one of the interesting things that we've realized is that innovation and technology are continuously going to make our life a little bit easier. Now we don't actually have to go all the way to the border between Kenya and Somalia to be able to talk to the elders. We are doing a documentary that is screened there, and we're getting results. Now we don't have to go to a village and put up a committee. Sometimes we set up a group, a Facebook group or a LinkedIn group or a Twitter group, and things are happening. So for the next 5 years, we see Coexist going more into technology, going more into innovation. But then also we see in the next 5 years, we see Coexist going more into mentorship. Because the challenge with work around gender and equality in Africa is that people don't mentor one another. You have wonderful programs that collapse the day the founder dies or stops working. So I want to spend the next 5 years trying to come up with a mentorship program. We are starting a mentorship program here. We're starting a diploma certificate for community mobilizers. We're getting very good responses. We want to train people to take over, work with communities, have the skills, give them basic communication skills. And so those are the 5 years we want to go. In the next 5 years are going to be challenging, because then doing something similar for 10 years is a bit challenging. So I'm also going back. I'm working on my PhD. I'm hoping to finish it in another year. I am writing books. This year we just finished working on 2 manuscripts that we hope the books will come out ready. That will make me. I've published 10 books, writing books. I want to do a bit of documentary. So there are lots of things that are coming up in the next 5 years.
So you talked a bit about, you spent the first 4 or 5 years of your organization without funding, and then it started trickling in. Are you finding that particular piece of your organization is seeing some change? I mean, there's a lot of initiatives from the United States and from Europe donors to push money down towards organizations such as yours that are implementing on the ground. You're what would be called the local implementer. Are you seeing a change in that regard, or is money still difficult to come by?
No. One of the things that you remember when we met last time, I said, Steve, one of the things that we thought technology was going to favor us was the opening up of the funding space, of the philanthropy space. And we thought technology had made it easier, because the challenge we have at Coexist is that we are limited in terms, because we don't have a sufficient funding. I'm having 10 members of staff, permanent members of staff, and I have to use most of the other work around the region and the country. I have to use interns from universities. And these interns only come here for 3 or 4 months. So they spend the first month learning the tricks of the game, 1.5. And then when they finally good to continue with the work, they have to be recalled, and they have to bring in another bunch of people, have to keep training. So the challenge has been, how do we expand an organization when the funding streams remain minimal? And the challenge has been, how do we get more donors? How do we get more visibility on the net? How do we get more people? How do we promote our crowdfunding platforms? Because in the last 1 year, I think I've created more than 5 crowdfunding platforms. And the highest amount I got was, I think, $50. That means we have a limitation in terms of resource mobilization. We have a limitation in terms of visibility because it looks like we're not targeting and getting to the right donors. We're just waiting for a few people to drop a few leftovers in a coin box somewhere on a crowdfunding, and we get $10 or $20. So that's the main major challenge.
Have you been able to partner with larger NGOs, larger international organizations, the UN? Have you been able to partner with any of them?
Yes, we have, but we have partnered with them at a project level, not at a program level. At a project level, meaning you have a project of to mobilize 1 million men. It's called 1 Million Men campaign that we did with UN Women. And then I did a project for UNESCO. I did a study on one of the most dangerous cultural practices called beading. And it was actually recommended as one of the best researches and projects. There has been no follow-up. I did some work with UNDP. So the work we do is piecemeal because we have a project that runs for 3 or 4 months. And then that's it. So you get little money to do the research and everything. What Coexist needs is to transition from getting project support to getting program support. Because when it gets program support, then you're dealing with other things that can make the organization grow. But when it's project support, you're limited to a tiny little project, and then you run around. And once the project is over, you have to then run around for another project, and that's also limiting.
At what point do you see some of your program? I mean, you gave us a couple of examples earlier in the conversation, but how do you know when your work is done in a community, or have you achieved that at some stage where you were telling us about the people who lived in the forest, or you're telling us about some people on the borderlands where you've been able to have some radical change? How do you know when your work is done, and how do you sort of hand the torch off? Is it basically your project comes to an end, or you have a process there?
One of the things is that Coexist has 3 key components that make our projects and our programs a bit unique. One is we have a very robust monitoring and evaluation strategy. We have 3 people, 2 serious people sitting on our monitoring and evaluation program who design follow-ups, who follow up the project from day 1 to day 2, and who satisfied that the project has now realized its either overall goal or its key objectives or it has achieved its strategies. 2 is that every project that we have has a sustainability plan. So we know that even if this project is going to be 6 months, how do we sustain it for another 6 months or another year without the donor support? So we have things like, for example, if we are running a project, we must always develop a synergy around it or a network of other organizations, so that when we exit, the other organizations continue with the work we were doing. Some of the things that we do is we also link up the communities. We work with communities. So within the community, we set up the follow-up, the sustainability plan, so the communities are able to continue. For example, when we work on child marriages, now when you go where we were, we created village champions. So now the champions continue creating more champions, and so it becomes a roller coaster that goes on and goes on and goes on. And then also 3 is that when we leave any project, we incorporate components of that project into our new coming projects. So, for example, if we were doing a project on child marriage in Wafula place, or female genital mutilation, or wife battering, or sexual violence, or HIV/AIDS, we make sure that when we have another funding in the same region, we incorporate part of that former project into the new project, so that gives it continuity. So we know when we are exiting, and we know that we have left enough monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in place.
Since you've had some success and you're starting to get the word out, have you seen other organizations pop up or other initiatives pop up that are starting to talk about men in the same way that you do, or do you kind of still feel like you're sailing the ship alone so far?
Yeah, I mean, the UN Women identified 5 organizations. Originally, Coexist was the only one talking about men. But now we have about 5 organizations in Kenya that are saying they are working with men. One is run around by religious people, it's between Christians and Muslims and everything. The problem is they're still boggled down by issues around patriarchy, because they have to base their work around gender from a biblical or religious point of view, which is also very diversionary. Yeah, because then I have to look at the Quran saying girls can be married at age 12 and a wife should be beaten, and the Bible that doesn't talk about the age of marriage, and the traditional ones that say as long as a girl has shown some breast, she can be. So in principle, that has become a difficult nut to sell. Two, there were two organizations that were being run by men organizations who ended up being perpetrators themselves. When the media goes in and discovers that the man who was saying, let's not be violent towards women, beat his own wife unconscious, then it becomes a bit interesting. There are 2-3 other organizations that are starting up, and we're actually supporting them as Coexist, sharing with them some of the tricks we've done, the tools around and everything, and they're doing fine.
So I always ask these last two questions to everybody on the show now that we've sort of moved into this innovation space and we're looking at different ways to do programming. You've talked about UN Women, you talked about UNESCO, and you said you're doing a PhD, but who do you pay attention to? And are you reading blogs? Are you following Twitter? Are you doing Facebook? Are there personalities out there that you pay attention to stay up to date or get new ideas that you'd want to share with others?
I follow so many other people, I don't even know who I follow anymore. I tweet every 30, 40 minutes every day. So I have thousands and thousands of followers on Twitter. I am on LinkedIn. I follow industrialists. I follow innovators. I follow people who are running market. I like people who are coming up with products that are IT based. I mean, I love innovation holistically, not just in IT and technology, but I love people coming up with new ideas. I also love people who coming up with projects. I mean, I'm now working on the interlink between climate change and gender violence. And when a guy mentioned that he had done a book and that it links gender-based violence to climate change, now we're in conversation. So I follow industrialists both locally and internationally. I follow stars, Hollywood stars, and stars of Nollywood and all these stars, and Bollywood stars that are doing great causes for societies, for communities, and yeah. So I follow people who are leading from the front. I'm
going to show my naivete here. Did you just say Nollywood?
Yes.
Is that Hollywood in Nairobi?
Nollywood is the Hollywood of Africa.
Where is that?
It's one of the biggest cinema industry in Africa. It's controlled from Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
But it sells movies across Africa. I mean, it's a multi-dollar billion business. It's shutting out Hollywood from Africa.
Sure, it's interesting because again, my naivete, and I apologize to everyone listening right now that this is me, but everyone knows about Bollywood and obviously Hollywood. But I'm that I'm talking to you from Bangkok right now, but I also discovered there's actually a Thai Hollywood as well, and of course the name is escaping right now as well. But these little things are all over the place now. I guess they're not little; they're huge. These are cultural movers and shakers, right?
Yes, they are, because one of the things is that the challenge with Hollywood was that it at some point it lost local contexts of issues, and so it became a bit universal and abstract, and yet there are things that people wanted to quickly identified with, and that's why you have, for example, Bollywood that pushes sort of an Indian look at things. And then we have a Nollywood now that pushes a traditional African interpretation of things, and they're very extremely popular. I have a 17-year-old daughter in my house and my wife, and as I have sometimes to drag them out of the sitting room just to get out of the Nollywood thing. So it's very popular. Yeah.
Okay, last question for you is, you spend obviously the vast amount of your time thinking about gender-based violence and women's issues and these other things, but what innovation or what is there something like completely outside of the work that you do that you think is ultra cool in the development or humanitarian aid space that you've seen recently that you'd tell others about?
I don't only work about gender-based violence, Steve. I also have a company called Mululu Consultants, which works on very serious corporate and policy issues. And so I don't, apart from being at Coexist and working on gender issues and everything, I also have a consultancy company that is very well recognized. But one of the things that I'm starting to like is, it's all, again, going back to technology. It's becoming easier in terms of the technologies that are coming that are linking communities and linking people. I was sitting here today and looking at how many listservs exist, for example, where you subscribe and get updates. I like that. How many places if you go to LinkedIn and see how many people are talking at the same time. mean, I like places where you expose your ideas to thousands and thousands of people, and I like marketplaces. Now I've published 5 books, but I don't have a hard copy in my hands because I'm publishing ebooks. So the opportunities even to be able to publish and access global markets is enormous. Only that of course the exposure gap between where I'm sitting in this little dusty town and where the other world is the difference, because we need people to anchor Africa into the mainstream world, or else this talk about Africa being the next frontier is not going to happen unless we get linkages.
Wanjala, thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm sure lots of people are going to like it.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a pleasure having you. Look forward to seeing you one day again, my brother.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.